Craig, Shirley, what changed for Americans on December 7th, 1941, and how quickly, how well did they follow Eleanor Roosevelt's guidance and lead there?
Well, first of all, I want to say is that her must have been marvelous for the American people to hear this, because she is so calm and soft and reasonable, and she's the pitch and the cadence are just wonderful and really almost professional. She did make one mistake in her broadcast, though. She said that, and this was it came out later, Doris Kearns Goodwin in her book about the Roosevelts. She made reference to the president was meeting with the Japanese ambassador at the time of the bombing, which she apparently was misunderstood, because he was actually meeting with a Chinese diplomat at the time. However, Japanese ambassadors were meeting with the Secretary of State at the time while the bombing was going on in Pearl Harbor. The country changed radically and permanently in many ways, and almost immediately. In many ways, December 7th is the bright line between what one historian said was the America of the past and the America of the future. And from that point forward, everything changes, and everything is not viewed, the war isn't just a part of the culture, the war is the culture, and everything's viewed through the prism of what was then called the emergency, because for many weeks after, it still wasn't called World War II, it was simply referred to as the war or the emergency.
Well, we're going to get to our viewers' calls for Craig, Shirley in just a moment. We showed Eleanor Roosevelt. We wanted to show you something new from the Franklin Roosevelt Library. They've just debuted online President Roosevelt's diary entries for December 7th, 1941. It shows a quiet morning. By afternoon, there are notations that the Vice President has arrived, along with the cabinet and congressional leaders. Craig, Shirley, what was happening inside the White House throughout December? How was FDR adjusting and getting the country on a wartime footing?
Well, that day, as far as I know, he was never actually in the Oval Office. He was in the second floor, where he liked to work, his study there, and he was having lunch with the White House aide, Harry Hopkins at the time, when he got a phone call from the Secretary of the Navy alerting him to the attack. He asked for confirmation, and then later phone calls came, and almost immediately after the attack, an communications blackout was clamped on Hawaii, so that all information that was coming out of there was going directly either to the War Department or was going to the White House, and they were actually controlling during the day the flow of the information. So Steve Early was the president's press secretary, and he held at least a half dozen press briefings throughout the afternoon into the early evening, giving further updates to several hundred reporters who had gathered at the White House that day. Eleanor Roosevelt described, when she first saw the president, she described him as deadly calm. When he was first told of the attack, he exclaimed, "Oh no." But then he quickly gathered himself, was by all accounts, very calm, very resolute, although there were several reports that night Henry Wallace, the vice president, had flown in from New York that night, and he arrived here in Washington about 6 o'clock. He was described as not depressed, but very somber. That evening he held meetings with both the cabinet and with the congressional leadership to give them the full briefing on the amount and the extent of the carnage in the Pacific that day, because it wasn't just Pearl Harbor that the Japanese had attacked that day. They'd also attacked Wake Island, Guam, Midway, the Philippines, the Malay Peninsula, and Hong Kong.
And the president mentions that, too, in his December 8th speech.
Exactly, yes.
Before we get to calls, I just want to ask quickly, your book is not about just December 7th, but about the entire month of December. What motivated you to take that approach and look at the entire month?
Well, I've done a couple of books about President Reagan's campaigns. I'm going to do more books about President Reagan, and I've had some other topics. But I grew up in a household, and Winston Groom made reference to this in his book, 1942. And I grew up in a similar household where, because my family was very, very steeped in the war effort. I had an uncle who was killed in the Pacific. My father and mother did scrap drives as children. Both my grandmothers were Rosie the Riveters. One was a bomb inspector, the other tested machine guns. And I grew up as a child in a household where on Sunday dinner they would gather the grandparents and the uncles, and the point of reference was either before the war, during the war, or after the war. My grandfather might say, Well, before the war, I bought that DeSoto, but I didn't sell it till after the war. So my family, like many, many other families in America, it was probably the most important event. In fact, it was the most important event of their lives.
We have lots of callers waiting to speak with you. Let's go first to Stamford, Connecticut. Here's Howie. Hi there.
Hi. How you doing, gentlemen?
Good. How are you?
Good, good. Yeah, I watch you guys every weekend. I love this programming. It's great stuff. So I'll make it quick here. 2 questions. The first one, with the Arizona, I heard today that a 1,700-pound munition was dropped on it. I never heard that before. I didn't know the Japanese had something that big. Did I get that right, or is that correct? Or
Howie, I don't know the amount, the weight of the actual bomb, but it did go into my understanding was that it went into the magazine of the Arizona. And not only did they have their own munitions stored there, but there were munitions stored there for several other ships. And of course, it exploded in a fireball and sank, I believe, within a matter of minutes. And over 1,000 men were entombed permanently on the Arizona within a matter of minutes of the Japanese bomb going into the magazine.
And I can tell, Howie, if you stay tuned, we're going to show you the tour of the visitor center there in Pearl Harbor with Daniel Martinez, who's the chief historian, and part of that he shows some of the armaments that both the Japanese and the Americans were using. So check that out, and if you don't have time to hang around, you can watch it online at cspan.org/history there in our video library as well. Kathy is in Aurora, Colorado, and she's next up.
Hi there. Thank you for taking my call. I got 2 quick questions. One of my questions is that I'm 61 years old now, and when I was in school, history was such a big part of it, and we had the Civil War during part of our semester, then we had World War II, and we did a lot of on December 7th. And I'm hoping that our teachers nowadays are still teaching this, because it is such an important part of our life. What happens when all our veterans are gone? We have to have where this is an important part of our life. And one other question I heard today earlier, and I think I understood there was a doctor who was working with the patients at Pearl Harbor, and he stated that he was not true that the nurses went out there and marked with their red lipstick that if they were going to be able to be saved or not saved and all this, because I know the movie Pearl Harbor, it emphasized the nurses going out there marking who could be taken care of and could not be taken care of.
Kathy, we appreciate the input. Craig Simons.
Well, first of all, Kathy, I absolutely agree with you about the teaching of history in our public schools. Another historian once said that those who fail to study history are doomed to repeat it. We study history for a reason, not just because it's entertaining or because it's, but we teach it because it's important to know about ourselves and about our culture and about our country and the problems that have faced it in the past and how maybe not to commit those same mistakes in the future. As far as the movie, the most recent movie, Pearl Harbor, there were a number of historical inaccuracies in it. One of them had Admiral Yamamoto with the fleet as it was attacking Pearl Harbor, and as a matter of fact, he was back in Japan. The more accurate movie depicting Pearl Harbor is Tora, 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 and I would urge you to look at that for the best historical account.
Raymond's on the line. He's a World War II vet from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Welcome, sir.
Yes, I'm in World War II, and I had a cousin who was a Marine in Pearl Harbor during the attack, and he said that he went over to the shed where they had the ammunition to get for the ammo, and it was locked. So, I mean, that was one of the stories. And one of the other stories that I heard that I wonder if any of the Japanese that were supposedly were spies, there must have been some spies on the island to direct the planes and so forth. Was any of them ever convicted or anything brought about them that they found that they were instilled in Pearl Harbor for the attack?
As far as the locker being attacked, being locked, I understand that is a correct story. There's lots of stories and anecdotes that are still coming out about Pearl Harbor. I was with a friend of mine the other day traveling out to Illinois, and his father was on the Maryland the morning of December 7th, and he'd been put on KP duty, and the morning of December 7th he was on the deck of the Maryland peeling potatoes when at about just before 8 a.m., all these Japanese airplanes descend out of the sky, and he has nothing in his hands except potatoes. And so he starts throwing them at the airplanes as they're whizzing by, because that's all he had in his hands. So there's lots of things still coming out.
Your book is a broad account of the days leading up to and after, using a lot of newspaper articles and other anecdotes. You also write about, like it's a Sunday, and the Redskins are playing on a Sunday here in Washington. Describe that scene for us.
Well, they were playing the Eagles. They were both out of the playoffs that year. Somewhat familiar pattern for this year. And as the game is being played here at Griffith Field, the management knows that Pearl Harbor has been attacked, but they said they had a policy, afterwards they said they had a policy not to announce war during football games, and it makes you wonder how many times that had happened before.
Yeah.
But over the PA system, there would come announcements saying, you know, Colonel Bratton, please call your office, or this military official. Also, a lot of reporters were called. One enterprising wife, actually sent a telegram to her husband, who was in the military, and had it delivered to his seat, so that to tell him, because they couldn't get a hold of him.
She had heard about it.
She'd heard about it, right. And apparently his office, the War Department, had tried to contact him at her home. They couldn't get a hold of him, so she sent a telegram to Griffith Field, had it delivered to him in his seat to report to his office. But everybody was called in immediately, and they were told to report in uniform.
Next up is